Ben Calder stood beneath the drooping wing of his Dornier aircraft, exhaustion weighing down on his broad shoulders. At 32, he was a man whose body had been battered by countless missions and sleepless nights. His sleeves were rolled up, his face sunburned from days of relentless medevac hops, his hands rough from handling equipment. Yet, even as fatigue gripped him, he found a moment of solace in the steady, comforting presence of his dog, Ekko. The 6-year-old German shepherd sat by his side, pacing restlessly as if sensing the tension in the air. Ekko's nails clicked against the cement, a rhythmic sound that had become as familiar to Ben as his own heartbeat. As the dog brushed against his calf, Ben's lips curled into a tired smile. He knelt down and scratched behind Ekko's ears, a small act of affection that felt like a silent promise between them. "Last rotation, partner," Ben whispered, his voice rough from days of little rest. "After this, we can sleep 6 straight hours." Ekko grumbled, a low, affectionate sound, before trotting to sniff the nearby boxes of water purification tablets. His presence was a reminder that, no matter how tough things got, he wasn't alone. Not yet. The morning felt deceptively peaceful, but the storm was coming. A cyclone, a furious force of nature, was pushing its way toward them, threatening to drown the fragile atoll they stood on. And yet, despite the looming chaos, Ben's mind couldn't help but focus on one thing: the bond he shared with Ekko. His dog wasn't just his partner in the field. Ekko was the only living being who understood the weight of Ben's every unspoken thought, the only one who truly knew the man behind the uniform. But little did Ben know, this moment, this seemingly calm before the storm, was about to be shattered. His life, his future, was about to change forever. The unthinkable would happen. And in his darkest moment, when everything seemed lost, his dog would be his last hope. Though what happened next would alter everything he thought he knew about loyalty, justice, and survival. The rumble of the approaching storm echoed through the air, an ominous reminder that time was running out. Ben glanced toward the sky, which had begun to darken with bruising purple clouds. The air felt thick and heavy, pregnant with the fury of the cyclone that was barreling toward them. Yet here, on Stormhaven Island, life went on. The workers and the evacuees moved swiftly, the buzz of helicopter rotors and the chatter of radio transmissions filling the air. Suddenly, a battered Toyota Jeep fishtailed onto the tarmac, its tires screeching as it came to a halt in front of Ben. The dust swirled around it before settling as the door swung open, and out sprang Lena Kessler. A whirlwind of motion, her blonde ponytail flicking behind her, camera straps swinging across her chest. She was a photojournalist, embedded with Doctors Without Borders, and from the look on her face, she had seen more than her share of devastation. "You promised me a seat off this island," Lena called, flashing a tired grin that didn't quite mask the fatigue in her eyes. Ben waved as he slid open the cargo door of the Dornier, already assessing the cargo. "I promised lift capacity," he corrected, his tone a mix of humor and professionalism. "Depends on what toys you're hauling." Lena chuckled, her fatigue momentarily forgotten. "Just lenses and one very soaked laptop. Nothing heavier than my optimism." As they exchanged banter, a more serious figure stepped out of the Jeep. Eva Kessler, Lena's older sister, looked every bit the part of the professional. A crisp linen blazer, her clipboard bristling with color-coded tags. Her gaze darted around, assessing the situation, as she approached with purpose. Ben couldn't help but notice the way her eyes lingered on Ekko, who was now lounging beside him, the camera mounted on the dog's harness blinking steadily. Eva crouched, offering a hand to Ekko, who sniffed it briefly before returning to his master's side. "The record's non-stop," she remarked with a neutral tone, her eyes flickering over the camera mounted on Ekko's shoulder. "Yep," Ben replied, his voice firm. "Say our evidentiary policy. The dog finds things humans miss, and the camera proves chain of custody." Eva nodded, clearly impressed, but her thoughts were already moving forward. She had that quiet confidence of someone used to taking charge, to getting things done. "Prudent," she murmured, straightening up and turning her attention to the task at hand. With cargo strapped down and passengers secured, the Dornier roared to life, the engines lifting off the tarmac as the plane soared into the air. Beneath the hum of the engines, the uneasy tension of the storm outside seemed to grow, filling the cockpit with an air of urgency. Ben's focus shifted back to the mission at hand. Ekko was at his feet, ever watchful, his ears twitching at every sound. The routine of the flight was interrupted only by the occasional crackling transmission over the intercom, chatter about the storm tightening its spiral. But even through all of that, Ben couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something else was coming. Something that would change everything. As they neared the mainland, the sky had taken on a deeper, more menacing hue. The winds were beginning to pick up, and the air smelled of rain and salt. The Poseidon security personnel, waiting at the airstrip in their black fatigues, seemed to sense it too. Their sergeant, a large man with a no-nonsense attitude, waved them forward. Animal Health Authority. The dog comes with us for quarantine and redeployment, the sergeant stated flatly, his eyes flicking to Ekko, who was sitting calmly at Ben's feet. Ben tensed at the words. He's registered with my SAR credential, he said, a slight edge to his voice. He travels with me, always. But Eva stepped forward, her demeanor calm and persuasive. I'll take responsibility, she offered smoothly, her voice cutting through the tension. I have the kennel paperwork and the NGO's inoculation logs in my vehicle. The sooner we clear procedures, the sooner Captain Calder can fuel up for the next evac. Her words carried weight, and Ben felt himself soften under the quiet authority she exuded. He unclipped the leash and gave Ekko a firm but gentle command. Ekko, heel. The dog rose to his feet, casting one last, trusting glance at Ben before following Eva without hesitation. The camera's red light blinked steadily as the dog trotted beside her, disappearing into the crowd. Ben watched them go for a moment, a tightness forming in his chest. He had been through countless missions, countless evacuations, but something about this felt different. The storm wasn't the only threat on the horizon. The accusation. The whirlwind of activity on the tarmac faded as Ben refueled the Dornier, checking his flight logs and trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. The storm outside raged ever closer, its fury reflected in the tension that had begun to settle like a thick fog over the island. Ben sipped at his lukewarm coffee, his mind turning over the small details of the morning, things that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt like ominous signals he had missed. Suddenly, the peace was shattered. The sound of heavy boots approached, their sharp, deliberate steps cutting through the hum of the airfield. 2 island constables appeared, their faces grim, their presence unsettling. Benjamin Calder? The older one asked, his voice gruff. Ben looked up from his coffee, his brow furrowing at the unexpected intrusion. Yes, that's me. What's going on? The senior constable didn't answer right away. He just moved closer, his hand reaching for his belt, and Ben's stomach sank as he saw the glint of handcuffs. Stand up, sir, the younger officer barked, his eyes cold as he gestured for Ben to rise. Confused, Ben stood, the blood rushing to his head. What's this about? I'm just trying to get this mission sorted out before the storm hits. The senior constable's expression hardened. You're under arrest for sexual assault. The words hit Ben like a punch to the gut. His breath caught, his mind struggling to process the accusation. He shook his head in disbelief, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and confusion. What are you talking about? Sexual assault? I haven't even seen her since we landed. Behind the officers, Lena Kessler stood in the doorway, her figure small but unmistakable. A blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes red, as though she had been crying for hours. A medic hovered beside her, offering quiet comfort, but Lena wouldn't look directly at Ben. Her gaze was distant, her face unreadable. The younger constable pulled out a notebook, his finger scanning down the page. Victim alleges you invited her aboard the aircraft at 4:30 hours, drugged her with ketamine, and assaulted her. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Gorporo footage recovered from your dog's harness corroborates position and timeline. Ben's heart dropped. His mind raced, but the words barely registered. That camera stays on Ekko, he protested, his voice rising in desperation. I never once went back to the aircraft. What the hell are you talking about? The younger constable didn't flinch. The footage is clear, sir, and the victim's statement matches. Ben's pulse hammered in his ears, his thoughts clouded by the disorienting confusion of the situation. Lena, please, you know this isn't true. You know I didn't do this. But Lena, her face pale and drawn, refused to meet his eyes. She simply stood there, her hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders, her expression tight with emotion, but not a word of support came from her. The cold weight of the moment settled over him. He had always trusted her, always believed in their connection, but now, with her silence, something was horribly off. This was more than a misunderstanding. The officers closed in on him, their steel cuffs clinking as they were snapped onto his wrists. Flashbulbs popped, blinding him for a moment, and the journalists on the sidelines were already moving in, sensing the scandal. Ben was shoved forward, his mind numb with disbelief. The storm outside seemed to pause in that moment, the only sound the low, distant rumble of thunder. He glanced back once, scanning the sea of vehicles and people, searching for Ekko, but the dog was nowhere in sight. Instead, he saw the orange vest discarded in the mud, the GoPro ripped off and hanging by a black wire. His stomach twisted. He knew Ekko, his loyal partner, was out there, alone and vulnerable. In that moment, everything that Ben had worked for, everything he had believed in, came crashing down. The storm was closing in, and so was the prison of lies that had been built. He was trapped, and the only thing that could prove his innocence, the footage on Ekko's GoPro, was slipping further from his grasp with every passing second. The courtroom drama. The days blurred into one long, painful stretch as Ben was thrust into the heart of a legal system that seemed determined to swallow him whole. From the moment they brought him into the colonial courthouse, Ben knew his fate had been sealed. The storm was still churning outside, its fury pushing against the walls of the courtroom, but the tension inside felt heavier, suffocating. The building, a relic of a bygone era with its coral stone walls and turquoise shutters, stood in stark contrast to the chaos that was unfolding within. The benches were packed with evacuees, some waiting for travel visas, others just trying to escape the looming disaster outside. But amidst the sea of anxious faces, there was no comfort for Ben, no space for his innocence to be heard. The whole place felt like a ticking clock, counting down to his downfall. Ben's public defender, a young man named Fong, smelled faintly of instant noodles and stress. He had barely 5 minutes to meet with Ben before the arraignment. "I've requested a continuance," Fong muttered in a hushed tone as he leafed through Ben's case file. "The storm's making it difficult to proceed, but the magistrate's not having it." Ben barely heard him. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. How could they do this to him? He had been framed, and worse, the evidence against him, evidence fabricated with cruel precision, was irrefutable in the eyes of the court. The trial moved quickly, more like a charade than a search for justice. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case. The first exhibit, a still frame from Ekko's GoPro footage. The timestamp on the frame showed Ben's gloved hand guiding a flask toward Lena's lips inside the Dornier cockpit. It was clear, damning, and impossible to ignore. Ben swore, with every ounce of conviction, that he had never been on the plane at that time. But his protest sounded thin, like a whisper against a roaring tide. Then came the second exhibit. A vial of ketamine, found beneath the pilot's seat, with a partial fingerprint matching Ben's. His stomach twisted as the courtroom gasped at the evidence. His hands had touched that vial, yes, but not in the way they were suggesting. His mind screamed in protest, but the more he spoke, the more the court seemed to close in on him. The third piece of evidence was the glove prints found on Lena's shoulder, prints that matched his work gloves. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they didn't fit the way they were supposed to. He had never touched her. He had never done what they were accusing him of. But no one was listening. Fong tried to object, but the magistrate waved him down. There was no time for debate, no space for doubt. The GoPro footage, the ketamine, the fingerprints, everything lined up against him in a way that seemed inescapable. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the walls of the courtroom close in on him. When the magistrate finally spoke, her voice felt like a hammer falling on his chest. "Guilty," she declared, her words echoing through the room. "Sentenced to 10 years at Refuge 9, effective immediately." Ben barely registered the rest of the proceedings. His world had shattered in those few, brutal moments. The truth, the one thing that could clear his name, had been wiped out. The camera footage from Ekko's GoPro, the only proof of his innocence, had been tampered with, erased by Poseidon's private security before it ever reached the police. The court had swallowed the lie whole, and he was left with nothing. Lena never spoke during the trial. Her eyes were distant, her expression unreadable. Ben's heart ached as he watched her sitting there, a silent figure of grief. When court recessed, he called out to her, but she faltered, looking away. Eva was there to usher her through a side door, and Ben's heart clenched. She had been the one who betrayed him, the one who had framed him to protect her sister. But even now, he couldn't fully hate her. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had been caught in something much bigger, a system of lies and manipulation too powerful to fight on her own. The sound of the gavel still echoed in Ben's mind as he was led away in handcuffs. The rain had started to fall heavily now, splattering against the courthouse windows, as if even nature itself wept for the injustice he had just suffered. But Ben couldn't let go of the one truth that still remained. He was innocent. And no matter what happened next, he would find a way to prove it. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside him. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Ben's prison experience. The ride to Refuge 9 felt like the descent into hell. The prison truck clattered over the rough, rain-soaked roads, its worn wheels struggling against the storm's relentless onslaught. Ben sat in the back, shackled, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his skin. He could feel the dampness creeping in as the truck jolted with each turn, the rain leaking through the seams in the rusted walls. But it was nothing compared to the icy weight in his chest. The storm was nearly upon them now, the winds howling as though they were trying to tear the island apart. But it was nothing compared to what Ben was facing, an isolation so deep it felt like he was being buried alive. His mind raced with the horror of what had just happened, the trial, the lies, the crushing reality that he was now a prisoner for something he hadn't done. He glanced around the back of the truck. The other prisoners were quiet, lost in their own thoughts, their eyes hollow and distant. Among them was Makoa, a hulking figure who had been eyeing Ben since they loaded him into the vehicle. Makoa leaned in close, his voice low and rasping. "Pretty boy pilot, they say you drugged the blonde." He chuckled darkly, his breath sour. "Rapists don't last long behind the wall." The words hit Ben like a slap, but he refused to let the fear show. He kept his face stoic, his gaze forward, as the prison loomed ahead. It was a fortress of stone and metal, surrounded by towering fences topped with barbed wire, each watchtower a silent sentry keeping watch over the hell inside. Ben's heart sank as the truck's brakes screeched, signaling their arrival at the gates of Refuge 9. As the doors of the prison opened and Ben was ushered inside, the heat of the storm outside collided with the stifling, oppressive air within the prison. The walls were thick, designed to hold in the despair, and every step he took seemed to echo back at him, a reminder of how far he had fallen. There were no allies here. There were only enemies, each one driven by their own desperation and survival. Ben was processed quickly. Mugshots, fingerprints, and the surrendering of his flight wings, everything that had once defined him now stripped away. They gave him an orange jumpsuit 2 sizes too small, the fabric uncomfortable against his skin, but that was the least of his worries. His real battle had just begun. They threw him into a cell, a cramped space with nothing but a thin mattress that smelled of mildew. The walls were cold, and the noise of the other prisoners, screams, shouts, the constant clattering of chains, only added to the sense of claustrophobia that threatened to suffocate him. But it wasn't the cell that terrified Ben. It was the knowledge that, in this place, truth had no value. His life, his future, had been taken from him, and there was nothing he could do to get it back. Hours dragged by, then days. The rain outside never stopped, a constant reminder that the storm was still raging. Ben tried to shut it out, tried to focus on something, anything that would help him keep his sanity intact. But it wasn't easy. The isolation, the hopelessness, it all chipped away at him, little by little. And as the days passed, he began to wonder if he'd ever see the outside world again. Then one night, as Ben lay awake, the sound of barking pierced the silence. He stiffened, his heart racing. Was it a dog? Was it Ekko? The thought shot through his mind like a lightning bolt, but he couldn't be sure. The storm outside had intensified, and the sound of the wind and the rain made everything harder to hear. In the morning, the noise started again, barking, frantic and loud, echoing through the prison yard. Ben's heart ached with the thought of Ekko, his loyal companion, out there somewhere, possibly confused and alone. Was the dog safe? Was he being taken care of? Or had he been forgotten, just like Ben had been? Ben pressed his face against the cold bars of his cell, the desperation rising inside him. He had to find a way out of here, to clear his name, to get back to Ekko. The truth was out there, somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. But in a place like this, surrounded by corruption and lies, it felt like the truth was as distant as the sun that never seemed to rise above the storm clouds. The only thing Ben had left now was his resolve. He would survive this. He would find a way to prove his innocence, no matter the cost. And he would get Ekko back. Because if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was that he wasn't going to let the storm, either the one outside or the one raging within him, take everything from him. Not without a fight. The fight for truth. As the days in Refuge 9 stretched on, Ben's resolve solidified. The storm outside had abated, but the storm inside him, the turmoil, the uncertainty, remained relentless. But with each passing day, something began to shift in Ben. He could no longer lie still, waiting for a fate that seemed inevitable. He couldn't accept the injustice that had been thrust upon him. He had to fight, and in this dark, hostile place, that fight would come from places he never expected. It started with Mara, the prison's doctor, a woman with a calm, steady gaze and an air of quiet authority, had been the first to show Ben any semblance of empathy. In the sterile, white-lit confines of the infirmary, she spoke in hushed tones as she tended to his injuries, the stab wound that had nearly claimed his life during his first few days at Refuge 9. But that night, as Mara finished suturing the wound, she slipped him a folded piece of gauze with a name scrawled on it in iodine, Cipher C Block 27. Ben knew that name, or at least he recognized the reputation. Cipher was a hacker, a man who had made a living by digging into systems, retrieving data, and breaking through firewalls that others thought impenetrable. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot Ben had. He had to get to Cipher, had to find a way to retrieve the GoPro footage from Ekko's camera before it was erased for good. It was his last hope. But getting to Cipher wouldn't be easy. The guards, the prison's security, and the ever-watchful eyes of Poseidon's corrupt officials meant that any attempt to contact someone like Cipher would be dangerous. Ben knew that. Still, he couldn't back down now. His mind raced, calculating the risks, weighing the possibilities. The storm had passed, but in its wake came a strange stillness, a sense of urgency that gnawed at the edges of every decision Ben made. The truth was slipping away, and with it, his chance at redemption. He waited for the right moment. It came a few nights later, when a lockdown alert blared through the corridors of Refuge 9. The prison was on high alert due to the approaching cyclone, and many of the guards were distracted with their preparations. Ben knew it was a fleeting opportunity. He had to act fast. Ben slipped out of his cell, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the guards' voices echoing down the hall, their boots heavy on the concrete floor. He pressed his back against the cold, unforgiving walls, moving quickly and silently. Each step felt like a gamble, a roll of the dice, but he was no longer afraid of the consequences. He was done waiting. When he reached C Block 27, his breath was shallow, his hands trembling with both fear and anticipation. He found Cipher's cell, tucked away in the far corner of the block, surrounded by shadows and isolation. Cipher was a wiry man, not much taller than Ben, but with an air of quiet danger about him. His eyes flicked open as Ben approached, and without a word he got to his feet, his movements swift and fluid. "Cipher?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Cipher's eyes narrowed as he studied Ben for a moment, before his lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Pilot, right?" His voice was smooth, with a clipped Singaporean lilt. "I know who you are." Ben didn't waste any time. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "They've framed me. They've got footage, but it's been tampered with. I need you to get it back." Cipher's eyes flickered to the guards moving down the hall. "And why should I help you?" he asked, his tone laced with amusement. "Because I'll get you out of here," Ben replied, his voice low, his words carrying a weight he hadn't realized. "You help me. I'll make sure you get out of this hellhole. There's a way. I have a plan. But I need you." Cypher studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the offer. Finally, he nodded, his expression serious. "You have 2 minutes. Then I'll help you." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ben had come this far, and now, with Cypher's help, he could see a flicker of hope on the horizon. The two of them huddled together in the dim, cramped space, Cypher pulling out a small, makeshift device from beneath his bunk, a repurposed smartphone screen etched with intricate circuitry. Ben felt his heart skip a beat. This was it. This was their chance. Cypher connected the device to the prison's network, and Ben held his breath. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that everything was riding on this one moment. The data, the footage, it was all so close. But they had to be fast. The guards were still patrolling, and the longer they waited, the greater the risk of being caught. Cypher's fingers flew over the makeshift keyboard, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "You're sure about this?" Cypher asked, his voice calm despite the urgency. Ben nodded. "Do whatever it takes. Just get it back." Cypher worked quickly, accessing the network, bypassing security, and slowly, inch by inch, he began to trace the digital footprint of the footage. Ben could feel his pulse racing as Cypher continued to break through barriers, one after the other. They were so close, but they were also running out of time. Outside the cell, footsteps echoed, growing louder. Ben's stomach clenched. The guards were closer now. "Almost there," Cypher muttered, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Just a few more seconds. The screen flickered, the progress bar climbing toward completion. Then, with a soft beep, Cypher pulled the data, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "It's done. We've got the footage." Ben felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The footage was theirs. Now they had the evidence they needed, the proof to clear his name. But they weren't safe yet. Before they could celebrate, the prison alarms blared, signaling a breach in security. Ben's heart skipped. It wasn't over. Not yet. But they had what they came for. The truth was now within reach, and with Cypher and Ekko's help, Ben would not stop until he exposed the lies that had trapped him in this nightmare. The fight for his freedom had just begun, the final showdown. The tension in Refuge 9 reached a boiling point as Ben and Cypher made their way through the dark, damp corridors, the stolen footage in hand and a clear path ahead. The prison alarms blared, echoing like a heartbeat in the night, but the real danger wasn't the sirens. It was what came next. The storm outside, once a distant threat, had now turned into a full-blown tempest. The wind howled against the prison walls, the rain slashing through the air, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with something else. Something far more dangerous. The walls seemed to close in, and every step Ben took felt like it was carrying him closer to a showdown he could no longer avoid. "Move fast," Cypher whispered urgently, his eyes darting to every shadow that stretched across the narrow hallways. The hacker had a coolness to him, but even he was starting to feel the pressure of time slipping away. Ben nodded, his mind focused on one thing, getting out. But not just that. He had Ekko's footage, the evidence that could prove his innocence and expose the conspiracy. All they had to do now was get to the heart of the prison, to the server hub where Poseidon's men had their hold on the truth. But with every second that passed, the risk of being caught grew exponentially. Cypher led the way through a service tunnel, his steps quiet and precise. Ben could feel the storm outside building into a frenzy as they moved deeper into the prison's underbelly. The power flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, and Ben knew they were running out of time. Ahead, the hum of servers and the flickering lights of the security room signaled they were close. They had reached the heart of the facility, the nerve center where the prison's data and surveillance systems were stored. But there was no turning back now. The storm outside wasn't the only thing threatening to tear this place apart. Suddenly, the sound of boots on the concrete floors rang through the hallway. Ben's heart slammed against his chest. They weren't alone. He froze, pressing himself against the wall, praying the guards wouldn't hear his breath. Cypher's voice was barely a whisper. "We need a distraction, or we're dead." Ben's mind raced. There had to be a way to break through. The guards were closing in, their voices growing louder. He needed to think quickly. He glanced at Cypher, whose fingers were already working to disable the security systems, but it wouldn't be enough. The only way to create a window of escape was to force a confrontation, and that meant going all in. "Ekko," Ben whispered, his eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of the dog. He didn't have to call twice. A low growl echoed from the shadows, and suddenly Ekko appeared, his massive form darting from the darkness, his ears pinned back and eyes focused. The shepherd was ready. Ben reached for the remote control attached to Ekko's harness, a signal for the dog to move in. The moment he pressed the button, Ekko surged forward with explosive speed, barking loudly, charging directly into the path of the oncoming guards. The chaos that followed was immediate. Guards scrambled, shouting orders, trying to regain control of the situation. But Ekko was already in full action, weaving through their legs, knocking one to the ground as the others scrambled to catch up. The dog's movements were fluid, precise, like a living weapon, and the noise was enough to send a ripple of panic through the guards. Cypher didn't hesitate. "Now," he hissed, his voice sharp with urgency. Ben dashed forward, his heart pounding in his ears, as Cypher hacked into the system, overriding the security protocols. The door to the server room clicked open just as Ekko barked again, sending the last of the guards scrambling away. Ben didn't waste a second. He was inside. The room was a maze of blinking lights and humming servers, all interconnected like the veins of the prison. Ben's eyes locked on the central terminal, where the data they needed to expose Poseidon's corruption was stored. Cypher was already at the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he bypassed the last few security measures. Ben's pulse raced as he watched the screen light up. They were so close. One last step. One last hurdle. Outside the room, the sounds of the storm intensified, but it was nothing compared to the fury that was about to be unleashed in the prison. Ben had no time to waste. "We need to go. Now." Cypher didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his concentration unbroken. But then, as the data began to download, an alarm blared, louder than any siren Ben had ever heard. The download was complete. "It's done," Cypher said, his voice steady but with a hint of satisfaction. But the celebration was short-lived. The door to the server room burst open, and a group of Poseidon security personnel stormed in. The leader, a man with cold eyes and a gun at his side, took one look at Ben and Cypher before pointing directly at them. "Stop right there," he commanded, his voice laced with venom. "You've made your last mistake." Ben didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the hard drive Cypher had retrieved, and turned to the door. Ekko, who had been causing a ruckus outside, was right behind him, his fur bristling as he charged past the guards, knocking them out of the way with brutal efficiency. Cypher followed close behind, already pulling a backup drive from his bag. "We've got what we need. Let's move." They rushed down the hall, every second feeling like an eternity as the guards scrambled to respond. The storm outside raged with fury, but inside, the chaos was just as intense. The battle for truth, for freedom, was happening right then and there. Ben knew they weren't out of danger yet, but with the evidence in hand, with Ekko by his side, he felt a spark of hope. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They would make it out. They would expose Poseidon, and nothing would stop them. Not even the storm. Vindication. The air in the helicopter was thick with tension, but for the first time in days, Ben felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The storm was still howling, the winds buffeting the chopper as it cut through the sky, but for Ben, the storm had shifted. It wasn't the one outside that mattered anymore. It was the one that raged within him, the one that had driven him to fight, to survive, and to clear his name. Ekko sat at his feet, his loyal companion, eyes wide and alert as the storm whipped around them. His presence was both a reminder of what had been lost and a symbol of the truth that had been unearthed. Ben could feel the weight of the hard drive in his hand, the data that would finally expose the lies and corruption, the footage that would clear his name. Behind them, Lena sat quietly, her eyes red, but there was something different about her now. Her expression was no longer filled with doubt or fear, but with the weight of the truth that had been uncovered. Ben could feel the shift in her too. She had seen the real story, the one that hadn't been told, the one that had been twisted and hidden. "We're almost there," Cypher said, his voice tight with focus as he worked the controls. "We just need to get this footage to the right people." Ben nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The battle wasn't over yet. The footage was crucial, yes, but there were still plenty of obstacles in their way. The Poseidon men, who had orchestrated the whole thing, were still out there, their influence far-reaching and powerful. But now, with the evidence in their hands, they had a weapon, something they could use to tear down the walls of lies that had been built around them. As they neared the coast, the island below grew clearer. The storm had begun to lose its fury, but the damage had already been done. Stormhaven, the island that had once seemed like a place of refuge, was now a battleground, one where the truth would be fought for with everything they had. When the helicopter touched down, the scene that greeted them was nothing short of chaos. The press was already there, their cameras flashing, reporters jostling for position as they tried to capture the aftermath of the storm. But amidst the noise and the frenzy, there was something new, an undeniable sense of justice that was about to be served. Ben stepped out of the helicopter, his heart pounding in his chest as the reporters rushed toward him. The truth was finally going to be revealed, but it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything that had been buried, everything that had been manipulated to protect the guilty. The press conference that followed was a whirlwind of questions, accusations, and revelations. Ben stood at the podium, Ekko by his side, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He spoke with conviction, telling his story, laying bare the truth of what had happened. He didn't hold back. He couldn't. Not anymore. The footage was released to the media, the damning evidence splashed across screens around the world. The frame-by-frame analysis of the GoPro footage, the timestamps, the clear timeline, it was irrefutable. The lies that had cost Ben everything were laid bare for all to see. There was no denying the truth anymore. As the reports poured in, the world began to take notice. The storm of corruption that had surrounded Poseidon Security started to crumble. Investigations were launched, questions were asked, and the public demanded answers. The governor, the officials, and the men who had orchestrated the cover-up were all implicated, their power shattered by the truth that had been buried for so long. But even as the storm raged outside, the real battle had shifted. The truth had won, and with it, Ben's vindication. His name was cleared, the charges dropped, and the conviction erased from the record. The world had seen the evidence, and they had seen Ekko's unwavering loyalty, the key to unlocking the truth. Lena stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm as they watched the aftermath unfold. There was no more guilt in her eyes, no more doubt, only understanding. And, somewhere deep within, a glimmer of hope that, perhaps, things could be made right again. Ben didn't look back as he left the press conference, his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the path that lay ahead. He had a lot of healing to do, a lot of work to rebuild what had been broken, but for the first time, he felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. "Ready to go home, partner?" Ben whispered, looking down at Ekko. The dog's tail wagged once, a silent promise that, no matter what came next, they would face it together. Ben smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't known in so long. "Yes," he said softly, "let's go home." And with that, the storm behind them was finally over. The truth had prevailed, the world had shifted, and the future was now, at last, in their hands. Ben and Ekko stood on the edge of the tarmac, watching the press conference unfold, the storm now a distant memory, as the world began to process the truth. The sunlight, once dimmed by the clouds of doubt and deceit, now pierced through, casting a warm glow over the wreckage of Stormhaven. The once crumbling island had become a symbol of something greater, a testament to resilience, to fighting for what was right, no matter the odds. Behind him, Lena, Cypher, and the team gathered their things, their faces reflecting the quiet relief of knowing they had done more than just survive. They had won. The truth had come to light, and though the path ahead would be full of rebuilding, it was a path that they would walk with their heads held high. For Ben, the journey hadn't just been about clearing his name. It had been about proving that no matter how dark the storm, the truth would always find a way through. His mind flashed back to the moments of doubt, to the dark nights in prison, when he had been so close to giving up. But then there was Ekko, his loyal partner, the one who had never doubted him, never turned away. Through it all, Ekko had been there, a constant reminder that they weren't alone in the fight. Ben inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. "We made it, partner," he whispered, his hand resting on Ekko's fur. The dog looked up at him, eyes bright and trusting. In that moment, Ben understood that their fight was not just about one man or one wrongful accusation. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be erased by storms or lies. It was about integrity, loyalty, and the unwavering belief that truth could never truly be buried. As the media frenzy died down and the last reporters packed up their cameras, Ben knew the real work was just beginning. The system had been shaken, but it wouldn't change overnight. He and Lena were already talking about the future, about starting the Innocence Project, helping others who had been wrongfully accused. The fight for justice was far from over. But for now, they had a moment of peace. Ben looked down at Ekko, his heart swelling with gratitude. He owed everything to that dog, the one who had been his silent witness, his protector, his partner in more ways than one. "We've still got a lot to do," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you and me, we're ready." Ekko wagged his tail as if to say, "Let's go." And with that, they turned toward the horizon, toward a future that, no matter how uncertain, was theirs to shape. As the sun set behind them, the world began to shift. The pieces of their lives, once scattered and broken, were coming together, just as the storm had passed and the calm began to settle in. Ben Calder, once framed, once lost, now stood tall again, a man who had weathered the storm and found redemption not in the world around him, but in the truth he carried. And no storm, no matter how fierce, could ever take that away.